They were nuns, women who swore their bodies to God. When the Vikings came, that vow became a sentence. Those who weren't killed were stripped, branded, and forced to serve the men who burned their altars. Some were turned into living offerings, drugged, strangled, or buried alive in rituals meant to please the gods. For the Norse, this wasn't madness. It was order, a theology built on pain. If you value the record over legend, subscribe. When the ledger closes, the bones still speak. The chronicles call them storms, sudden, merciless, divine. But the fires of those raids didn't vanish with the wind. They calcified into systems. When Viking longships cut across the Irish Sea in the 9th century, they carried more than blades. They carried a doctrine that holiness was a resource and purity was a prize. The monasteries they targeted weren't fortresses. They were vaults, filled not only with gold and relics, but with bodies sanctified by vows of chastity. To the Norse, these women were not victims. They were symbols. Taking them meant victory, not just over kingdoms, but over gods. Archaeologists found this logic written in iron. At Clonmacnoise, Ireland, the soil revealed a trench lined with iron cuffs, small, delicate, circular. The bones within were all female, their wrists fused from pressure, their ribs fractured inward. They hadn't died in battle. They had been restrained, displayed, and discarded. Each monastery followed the same pattern: fire, capture, silence. Behind the ritual of slaughter lay something colder: administration. In Norse law, conquest was never chaos. It was paperwork. A century after the raids began, the Gragas and Frostathing codes defined what to do with foreign women of the faith. If a woman of another god is taken, one clause reads, her will is void. She is wife by right of war. Her children are rightful heirs. It was written as legal protection, but for whom? Not the women, for the men who took them. The law transformed rape into legitimacy, and children born from captivity into dynastic evidence. Ownership required witnesses. A captor had to declare his claim publicly, to ensure no dispute over his property. Failure to register meant fines. Even horror had deadlines. In this new theology, sin was not punished. It was notarized. The Vikings believed civilization required order, and order required records. That was their genius. They didn't simply conquer, they documented. By the mid-800s, purity itself had a price. At Dublin's Wood Quay, carved runestones listed human inventory beside wine and furs. 20 sisters, pale of skin, unspoiled. Each line represented a transaction. Young women fetched 20 silver coins, older ones 15, wounded ones 10. Purity depreciated with age and pain, holiness measured by market demand. One fragment shows a symbol beside a name, a cross inverted into a trademark. It was not desecration, it was branding. These were not random acts of cruelty. They were structured exchanges between faith and profit. The same ships that carried stolen chalices and gold carried the women who once guarded them. Each voyage linked monastery to market, prayer to price. The Norse didn't invent slavery, they systematized it, with theology as their blueprint. The Norse word blot meant sacrifice, but also transaction. When they seized holy women, it was not for lust alone. It was for ritual. Excavations from boat burials in Denmark reveal female skeletons arranged in ceremonial circles, wrists bound, skulls tilted skyward. Chemical traces in their teeth show henbane and mandrake, hallucinogens used to paralyze the body, preserving composure until death. They were made to appear willing, an illusion of consent sanctified by drugs and doctrine. A chronicler from the 10th century described it plainly. They said the gods desired beauty silent. To the Norse, silence was purity. Purity was proof of divine favor. To make a holy woman silent was to conquer the divine itself. This was not random savagery. It was a liturgy. Each act performed as offering, each death recorded as covenant. For the Church, these women were martyrs. But the Church's records end where commerce begins. Because what came next? Ransoms, trades, and silent negotiations would stain every holy institution that claimed innocence. Bishops wrote condemnations of pagan cruelty while accepting silver from ransom payments. Monasteries rebuilt themselves with the same money earned from selling captives back. Faith became complicit in its own exploitation. The chronicles describe only losses of relics and desecration of the altar. They omit the women. Silence became strategy, the first form of damage control. But the earth remembered what the ink refused. At Port Marnock, 23 female skeletons were found buried in sequence, all showing the same pattern: blunt trauma, crushed ribs, broken wrists. No swords, no shields, no resistance. They were killed according to instruction. It was the earliest known example of ritualized gendered execution in Northern Europe. The pattern was so precise that forensic teams now call it the Port Marnock sequence: capture, restraint, assault, disposal. Not rage, not chaos. Procedure. How does a civilization convince itself that holiness must suffer to survive? How does law, meant to restrain violence, become its language? For the Vikings, cruelty was not the breakdown of order, it was order. Pain was proof of power. Every brand, every birth, every silent death extended their empire beyond geography, into theology. When we strip away the myth of the savage raider, what remains is a machine, fueled by law, justified by faith, maintained by silence. And that's what makes this story worse than death. Death ends pain. But this was designed to endure, in laws, in ledgers, and in the bones that still speak beneath the soil of Europe. By the 10th century, the Viking raids no longer looked like chaos. They looked like infrastructure. Every port, every monastery, every shipyard formed a link in a continental chain, a machine that converted sanctity into currency. The Church saw blasphemy. The Vikings saw logistics. From Dublin to Hedeby, Bergen to Kiev, the same rhythm repeated: capture, catalogue, transport, resale. Each step had law, witnesses, and fees. Holiness was standardized. In the ledgers of Hedeby, the word kona egna, owned woman, appears beside numbers for cattle, wine, and iron. It wasn't a euphemism, it was inventory. Even the sacred were quantified. Faith had become an export commodity. Archaeologists call them holding complexes. the sagas never mention them. At the edge of Norse trade towns, long wooden halls were built beside temples. Narrow, windowless, lined with drainage grooves. For years, they were thought to be storehouses for goods. Soil analysis told another story. Human blood, calcium, fetal remains. These were not warehouses. They were containment chambers for women. At Hedeby's southern quarter, one chamber still bears iron rings bolted to its walls. The floorboards are scored from chains dragged across them, hundreds of times. In the corners, residue of brine and animal fat used to wash captives before sale to make the flesh appear pure. It was a grotesque parody of baptism. They washed the women in salt water, shaved their heads, wrapped them in white cloth, then presented them to buyers as virgins purified by the sea. Everything was ritualized, the transaction, the silence, the degradation. To the Vikings, ritual and record were the same act. By the mid-9th century, Christian kingdoms across the Irish Sea began ransoming captives. They claimed it as an act of mercy. In practice, it was accounting. For every nun ransomed, the church paid silver back into the very system that enslaved her. Some monasteries even taxed the process, 1/10 of every ransom collected for restoration of the altar. In York, a fragment of a bishop's letter survives. It laments the loss of our holy sisters, yet, on the reverse side, lists amounts paid for their retrieval. Every tear had a receipt. The trade between holiness and gold blurred the moral line beyond repair. Rome condemned the Viking slave markets in sermons, while accepting tithes paid in Viking silver. Purity and profit became indistinguishable. The Vikings had no use for idle captives. Those not sacrificed were repurposed. At Repton, archaeologists uncovered a long building with ventilation holes beneath the floor and channels cut for drainage. Human bones mixed with ash and straw, evidence of confinement, childbirth, and repetitive labor. This was not a chapel. It was a breeding hall. Women captured from monasteries were forced to bear children for their captors. The Gragas Code stated that a child born of property shares its mother's worth. If the mother was owned, so was the child. If the child could not serve, it did not live. Infants' skeletons buried around these halls show clean fractures to the skull. Deliberate, not accidental. Infanticide was not secrecy, it was policy, a measure to maintain the purity of inventory. To the Norse, these deaths balanced the cosmic ledger. Every sacrifice kept the world in order. They called it svid, cleansing by fire. Silver coins have been found buried among infant remains, proof that even purification was monetized. The true sophistication of the Viking system wasn't in its cruelty, but in its precision. Each market functioned like a government office. Inspectors verified captives' condition. Scribes recorded transactions. Traders paid tolls to transport human cargo through river routes. At Novgorod and Kiev, Arabic merchants described Christian women sold beside fur and amber. Their documents include prices, dates, and tax stamps from Norse customs houses. It was the first multinational network of sanctified slavery. Each harbour had its own registry stone. One fragment from Birka reads, "Erica gave to Thor 2 white sisters for safe seas." An inscription of faith and an invoice of flesh. Even filed. A woman spared for service owed her captor labor until death. Refusal meant branding. a cross-shaped scar carved into the thigh, a parody of the very symbol she once worshipped. The Vikings called it husmarke, the house mark. It meant ownership and silence. By the late 9th century, the Viking world was changing. Empires stabilized, raiding turned into governance. Fear had to become sustainable. That's when torture turned procedural. At York and Dublin, archaeologists found pits 3 feet wide and 6 feet deep, with smooth walls and small air holes carved near the surface. Inside were skeletons of women buried upright, wrists bound. Some pits showed signs of slow decomposition, evidence they were kept alive for days. These were not executions, they were spectacles. According to Frostathing law, any captive woman who defied her owner or invoked a foreign god was subject to Yardfist, the earth vigil, buried alive, fed through reeds, left to die slowly so the ground might taste her fear. Witnesses reported that other captives were forced to sprinkle salt over the living graves. The Vikings said it kept the earth clean. In truth, it kept the women silent. This was not chaos. It was policy. Terror turned into administration. When the Vikings finally converted to Christianity, the violence didn't end. It evolved. The same ports that once sold nuns as slaves became penitential houses. The same chains that bound them became vows of service. The system was baptized, not abolished. A surviving document from 953 records 6 penitents of pagan birth, transferred to an abbey in exchange for 1 chalice of silver and a psalter. The sale reads like a donation, but every word mirrors the old Viking contracts. Pain had simply changed language. The pagan word kona egna, owned woman, became the Latin ancilla Dei, handmaid of God. The economy of captivity had found its holy disguise. By the turn of the millennium, the Viking system had fused with Christian law. Monasteries rebuilt by the church were staffed with redeemed women, former captives whose servitude was declared sacred. They worked without pay, bound by vows of silence. Atonement became labour. In the abbey records of Whitby, England, archaeologists discovered ledgers listing the output of linen and bread, followed by a chilling line. 5 sisters deceased, their souls accounted, and even death was tallied as productivity. This is how the machinery of sanctity survived. Pain became virtue, obedience became holiness, and silence became currency. To the Vikings, order was sacred. To the church, order was salvation. Both believed in structure. Both required silence to function. The Vikings perfected the logistics of faith. The church perfected its language. And together, they built a world where suffering wasn't an error. It was evidence of divine will. From Dublin's slave docks to Rome's altars, the logic spread. If pain serves purpose, it can be holy. If silence preserves order, it must be good. If law records it, it must be just. That was the final conversion, not of souls, but of morality itself. Holiness was no longer what freed you from suffering. It was what justified it. The system of sanctity had done its work. Faith had become infrastructure. The bodies of holy women were no longer buried in secrecy. They were built into the foundations of empire. The bones beneath the monasteries, the silver in the chalices, the prayers sung over old chains, all testify to the same truth. The Vikings didn't destroy Christianity. They taught it how to survive. And the church, in turn, ensured that their system, the theology of control, would never truly die. By the year 1000, the Viking ships had vanished, but their order remained. Christian kings now ruled the same harbours once filled with slave markets. The signs of faith changed. Crosses replaced hammers, yet the system stayed intact. The church had inherited a perfect machine, a bureaucracy that made obedience look divine, and labour sound like salvation. The same women once branded as property were renamed penitents. Their servitude became lifelong prayer, their chains became vows, and their children, born from violence, were baptized as evidence of grace. It was the ultimate inversion, sin transformed into sanctity. The monasteries rebuilt on Viking ruins were financed with Viking silver. At Whitby, archaeologists found rosaries made from melted Norse coins. The instruments of domination literally became the symbols of faith, and that faith would rewrite history itself. Centuries later, when modern geneticists tested mitochondrial DNA in Scandinavia, half of all maternal lines traced back to Ireland and the British Isles. These weren't peaceful migrations. They were memories, written in blood. The women whose names were erased had survived through inheritance. Their bodies, once branded as spoils, became the foundation of families, dynasties, nations. Every king who boasted of Viking descent carried within him the lineage of women enslaved in monasteries. But medieval Europe could not afford that truth. So, it invented purity. By the 11th century, the Church issued decrees demanding proof of Christian ancestry for marriage among nobles. Children born from mixed blood, the descendants of enslaved nuns, were branded bastards, forbidden to inherit. The irony was obscene. The Church condemned the very bloodlines it had baptized, purging the evidence of its own complicity. In France, clerical records show nobles paying indulgences to prove untainted lineage. In England, monks erased names from baptismal rolls if their mothers were foreign or enslaved. The act of erasure became a sacrament, a second kind of purification. Europe was purging not sin, but memory. The conquest of faith had become the conquest of archives. To maintain holiness, history had to forget. Monasteries that once kept records of ransoms began keeping genealogies. Birth ledgers replaced death registers. The names of the enslaved women vanished, line by line, replaced with saints and martyrs. But some evidence refused to disappear. At Repton, a Viking stronghold turned Christian burial site, archaeologists found 2 layers of graves. The upper, neat rows of crosses and rosary beads. The lower, a mass pit of women with broken wrists, bound hands, fractured skulls. Centuries later, priests exhumed those bones and reburied them as relics of unknown saints. The victims became holy once more, not as people, but as symbols. Their suffering repurposed again for faith. This was the perfection of the system: to erase someone's story, then sanctify their silence. When cathedrals rose across Europe in the 12th century, their blueprints copied Viking warehouses, long rectangular halls, arched beams, vaulted ceilings. Architecture preserved what theology tried to forget. Every cathedral stood on buried foundations, literally built over bones. At Birka, beneath a church altar, archaeologists found 34 female skeletons, all showing trauma identical to earlier Viking sites. One had a rosary bead embedded in her jaw, swallowed, perhaps, to protect it from desecration. Faith had paved itself over the evidence. And so the very spaces that claimed to cleanse sin were consecrated by unacknowledged suffering. This was the birth of medieval Europe, a civilization that turned horror into holiness, slavery into service, and history into myth. The Viking Empire had ended, its method had not. 1,000 years later, the ground began to speak again. Construction workers in York, Repton, and Dublin unearthed remains, small skeletons, female bones, iron rings. At first, they were dismissed as monastic burials, but forensic study told a different story. Signs of prolonged kneeling, compression fractures in spines, mercury and henbane, the same hallucinogens used in Norse ritual. These weren't peaceful deaths, they were procedures. Each site matched the same chronology, 850 to 950 CE, the age of the holy slave trade. What the chronicles erased, the bones restored. At Dublin, excavation teams found wooden tags marked with short runes: sold, bred, buried. Each tag matched a female skeleton. They were receipts, physical proof that every act of cruelty had been recorded, archived, administered. Even in atrocity, there had been order. History often asks who the Vikings were, but the better question is, who learned from them? The church adopted their methods of control, the kingdoms absorbed their bloodlines, and modern civilization inherited their logic, that suffering, if structured, can be justified. Pain, when managed, becomes policy. Silence, when institutionalized, becomes virtue. This is the legacy of both cross and hammer. Every cathedral that sings hymns over old bones still resonates with that unspoken arithmetic. Faith multiplied by power equals obedience, and obedience, when enforced, becomes civilization. When historians say Europe was reborn after the Dark Ages, they overlook what rebirth meant. Not enlightenment, but rebranding. The Viking Empire didn't die, it was baptized. In 2019, archaeologists reconstructed the faces of 3 women found beneath York's Nunfield. They were not saints or monsters. They were ordinary, tired, human, defiant. Their wrists bore the faint imprint of shackles, their jaws, stress fractures from years of silence. For the first time in 1,000 years, they looked back, and their gaze shattered the illusion of holiness. Because history's cruelty wasn't hidden in the violence, it was hidden in the justification. Every age finds a way to call its control righteous, whether through law, through scripture, or through order. The Vikings built the logistics, the church built the language, and we inherited both. What they did to holy women was not simply worse than death. It was immortality without voice, a kind of eternal captivity, preserved in bones, laws, and prayer books. When holiness can be bought, when law can bless cruelty, when obedience can be mistaken for faith, what part of civilization is truly civilized? The Norse Empire ended in fire. The Church Empire endured through silence. Both thrived on the same principle. Control is easier to maintain when it calls itself sacred. The bones buried under Europe's cathedrals do not accuse, they testify. And their testimony is simple. No empire dies, it only changes its language.